Young people today are growing up in a world very different from when their parents were in school. Rapid cultural changes, driven by new technologies, globalization, and shifting norms, present new challenges to Christians when it comes to how we seek to engage unbelievers in evangelism and apologetics. In my conversation today, I'm speaking with Dr. David Dockery, someone who has spent decades as a leader in higher ed, helping students think critically about Christianity, the Bible, secularism, and what it really means to follow Christ today. David currently serves as president of the International Alliance for Christian Education, as well as president and distinguished professor of theology at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's also written or edited numerous books, including Confident Witness, Evangelism and Apologetics for the 21st Century from Crossway. Let's get started. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me today on the Crossway podcast.
It's a joy to be with you, Matt. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So I think it goes without saying that we're living through a period of time of really incredible cultural change that's related to our political division and situation, global realities and instability around the world, economic challenges, and then a whole slew of cultural ideas and norms and sensibilities that have really changed a lot over the past couple of decades. And all of that stuff is even heightened by the technology that we all have, even in our pockets now, where it seems like change just comes faster and faster all the time. And I think all of that change can sometimes make the task of evangelism and apologetics today feel even more intimidating than maybe they already typically do and have in past generations, especially for the average Christian who's trying to keep up. So I wanted to start us off. Can you resonate with that sense of, wow, things are changing fast, and I don't always know how to think about that?
I think the 21st century has been characterized by rapid change. And I think we reflect on the fact that we're now a quarter of the way through this century, and it feels like there's been more change in the first 20, 25 years than we saw in the whole last half of the 20th century, if not even more so. And a lot of it is driven by technology. A lot of it's driven by the global aspect of the world in which we live now. It feels so different to most of us, I think. A world that we took for granted hardly exists anymore. And so we want to try to contextualize the responsibility of evangelism that belongs to those who are followers of Christ for this world in which we live.
Yeah, in a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the unique apologetic and evangelistic challenges that face the church today. But before we do that, I want to start out by talking about what you mentioned there, students in higher ed, the world that you've spent most of your career working in. It's often said that as goes the university, so goes the culture, a sentiment that I think gets at the unique cultural power that centers of learning often have in our society. That sometimes ideas that are first incubated on a college campus, even ideas that seem extreme initially, can oftentimes spread out of that campus and become more mainstream in the broader culture. It's just to kind of start us off. Have you seen that to be true? Do you think is that just a boogeyman that is often talked about, or is that actually happening?
No, I think that's reality. I think things that were almost silent, certainly quiet, minority conversations taking place on college campuses 50, 75 years ago are more dominant things today. Many of the issues that we deal with regarding life, human sexuality, understanding of freedom, individual emphases versus community, all of those kind of things were gelling and bubbling up. Go back to the 50s and 60s in the middle of the 20th century, and how all of that would begin to change the way we think about life, culture, relationships, engagement. We've had to reflect on those things deeply, I think. It is true that what happens on a college campus is pretty much downstream from what happens later on in culture. Things are birthed and then you see them take place. And that's true whether it's public institution or a private institution, a more secular institution or a church-related or Christian institution. I think you can say that as is true as a generality. There are different initiatives flowing out of those things, and sometimes they come together to clash, and sometimes they become, the things that are soon taken for granted as those college students breathe that air, and then by the time they're 40 years old, that becomes norm for their
Mm.
particular context.
So, why do you think it is that these higher educational institutions, these centers of learning, why do they have such an influential power over our culture?
Well, I think they've been that way for decades, if not centuries. The what we know as the modern university goes back to the 12th century and the founding of the medieval universities, in which the very best and brightest, it was a very elite group of people who were able to come. Almost all of them connect to the church, and we still know of some of these institutions today. Oxford, Cambridge, University of Paris, some of these kind of institutions had dominating influence because of the professors who were there, their brilliance, and the quality of students who could come. And then they would go and influence the church, society, culture of their day. And then with that came, with these centers of learning, came publication opportunities, which echoed this beyond the campus and gave
Mm.
others opportunity to read and think and reflect on what was going on. And so the echo effect through the publications plus students multiplying themselves, that you began to see changes. What we know is the Protestant Reformation, which celebrate October 31st every year, took place at the University of Wittenberg. We often talk about Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the church house door, but he was a university professor at the time that he did that. And those conversations that led to that were swirling, not in the church so much, but in the university. And then it was through the university, through Luther and Melanchthon, that the ideas of the Reformation began to spread. And so both in society and in the church, this has been the case. There's never been a case, to talk about it more in Christian terms, there's never been a case where the gospel has been extended and churches have been planted, and the gospel has been able to be saturated into a context and then passed on to the next generation without some kind of educational entity following it. And so, I mean, you
Mm.
follow even the early modern missionaries, William Carey, Adoniram Judson, shortly after they were there, they planted schools where they were, in addition to churches. And so when the Puritans and Pilgrims came to this country, they want to begin to start schools. And so you have Harvard in 1636 and Yale in 1701 and continued thereafter. So schools have been vitally important for educating the next generation and preparing them not only for what is happening now, but preparing them for what is forthcoming. Colleges and universities tend to live 20 years ahead of everyone else, trying to prepare those students for what's coming down the road. And that has only multiplied and accelerated and been exacerbated by some of the things we mentioned earlier: technology, globalization, and the amazing way that knowledge is now available. Information is so widely available to people.
Yeah, it can be so easy in these conversations about the impact of higher ed on our culture to think in more recent terms, where we can think of a lot of, at least to feel conservative Christians, a lot of negative examples, the negative impact that higher ed has had on our culture. But as you pointed out there, if you go back a little further, we see just the incredible connection between the spread of Christianity, the spread of distinctly Christian worldview ideas with education and schools and seminaries. And do you think that's still happening today? You're the president of a seminary. You've been the president of another seminary before that. Do you think that Christian schools are having a culture shaping influence today?
I think they are having an influence on the Christian culture. I wish we were having a greater influence beyond that. I think because of the rapid change of the past decades, to which we keep referring, I think many of us find ourselves or hear of others or watch and observe in more of a defensive posture sometimes, and which is also a New Testament idea of guarding the gospel. It's echoed many times in Paul, particularly in the pastoral epistles, of guarding that which has been entrusted to us. And so, because we see the rise of secularization, the 30% or more of people in North America now claiming to be religiously unaffiliated, or nuns, as they sometimes are called by the sociologists, we realize how different those statistics are from, say, a Gallup poll of 1965. And so I think we find ourselves still influencing the church, but somewhat in a defensive posture. And so even one of the purposes of the publication of Confident Witness is to encourage those students to be salt and light and take that gospel witness into that culture, and to realize that it is our responsibility to do so generation after generation.
Yeah, in the book, two of your co-authors, Jim Dennison and Mark Legg, they refer to the era when Billy Graham, for example, was doing all these revival crusades. They say that that era, that effort represents, quote, a golden age of spirit-led opportunity, a time when the general public thought very highly of the Bible. They thought highly of Christians generally. They thought highly of the church even, something that kind of seems amazing to us, I think, in our day today. And although there were obviously lots of problems in culture and society at that time, as there always are, it seems like in general, American culture was more amenable to the claims of Christianity than it is now. So I wonder, how would you summarize the difference between, that past generation when it comes to how the culture viewed Christianity and how the culture views us today?
Yeah, I think the entire cultural context was shaped by Judeo-Christian view, what the sociologist Peter Berger used to call the canopy that kind of rested over culture. But then his writings were always filled with this idea that the sacred canopy is disappearing. And what do we do with what he called increasing trends toward, he always stressed three things: the move toward secularization, privatization, and pluralization. And so where religion or Christianity continued to have staying power, it still tended to be done since toward privatization. And so what became a public affirmation or a public acceptance soon became something very private and privatized. Robert Putnam calls it bowling alone, that move toward privatization. And so we keep those things to ourselves and don't necessarily share them with others. And so I think that the combination of these various trends, there's always been some sector, some issue, some movement that has seemed to be in conflict with the church and with the gospel. I mean, that's as early as once you get past Pentecost in the book of Acts, you begin seeing that, and Peter and John are in big trouble by the time you get to Acts chapter 4. So it didn't take very long for that opposition to come. But what feels different today is that it's not one thing. It's this multifaceted combination of things coming from seemingly every direction. And that makes it feel very different, I think, for Christians, particularly younger Christians, high school, college age, young adults, did not experience the, quote, golden years of the Billy Graham era, in
Mhm.
which there was at least respect for, appreciation for. I mean, the late 1940s, Mr. Graham goes to Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles Times covers that amazing crusade. And then, less than a decade later, 1957, he goes to New York, and they pack out Madison Square Garden night after night after night, week after week after week, and everybody who's anybody in this most significant city in the world, in New York City, wants to be at the Billy Graham crusade. Whether they want to respond or not, whether they do, they want to say they have been. And it was it was a cultural event to be a part of. Now it's a cultural event to avoid, to not be seen with. And it certainly feels different for the
Mm.
generation coming along.
Yeah, it seems like there are two ditches for us as Christians today. On the one hand, we can act like and we can think that, the cultural resistance that we sense when it comes to our faith is completely unprecedented, that all past generations, were in a purely golden age with no issues before, no persecution, no resistance. And that's obviously not true. As you said, every generation has had issues in the prevailing culture that were pushing against faithful Christianity. But it seems like there's also the other danger of underestimating the significance. I'm just thinking, you mentioned young people today. Someone growing up as a young person in a biblically faithful church in a home where they're taught to respect what God's word actually teaches, they could very easily start to feel that they're at odds with the prevailing culture in almost every major area. And that there is really there's no relief from feeling like they're constantly at odds with the prevailing culture. I think that is probably a bit of a new dynamic that we need to understand and
Yeah.
appreciate as
And
we
I
think
think,
about
yeah, and we have to
young people.
help people not to fall into either side, because when you fall into either side, you tend to become reactionary to whatever comes next. And the church in a reactionary mode is rarely a good thing. We need to
Mm,
be responsive, but not reactionary. And we need to always be listening. Great theologians have said we need to have the Bible in one hand and they used to say the newspaper in another. No one reads a newspaper anymore, but a computer screen with your phone, whatever, however you intake that kind of information so that you're following it and exegeting scripture and exegeting the culture at the same time to make sure you don't overreact to either, and to make sure that we're learning from the culture and not missing what's going on, but make sure we're seeing culture and interpreting culture through the scriptures, not the other way around, because then we begin to devalue the authority of the Bible and we lose our theological compass. And before long, we lose our life compass.
mm. So many people will say that we're currently living in a culture that values feelings over facts and opinions over arguments and maybe even personal stories over even the notion of objective truth. People often refer to our era as a post-truth era. But Christianity, as we know, is a religion that is really at its core making very clear truth claims about God, claims about the world, claims about us as humans, as creatures. So, how do we reach a culture? How do we start to approach a culture that has, in so many ways, abandoned the whole notion of objective truth?
Yeah, I think that we learn from the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 17 and begin with people where they are. And we recognize people do live in this experiential context and that they, for the most part, are yearning to share that experience with others. Most people don't enjoy the sense of individual isolation, the privatization gone to extreme. They want to live in community. And so I think what we offer is that the Christian faith creates this wonderful dynamic. We call it koinonia, fellowship, sense of belonging, I think is what people are looking for. And helping people find that sense of belonging through relationships with believers. So we have to develop relationships in new and fresh ways, be willing to open ourselves up to sharing our own journey, our own struggles, and identifying with these folks. So I think there are three big questions that people continue to wrestle with, and sometimes from generation to generation that the order of these changes. But right now, I think helping people find a sense of belonging tends to be the leading question. If you go back to say the 1960s or 1970s, the question was more about who we are, more of an identity question, trying to figure that issue out, which is also an important part of developing Christian worldview and understanding the big picture. But that's an important question, but I think it's secondary to the belonging question. But helping people to get to one of those two questions, where do I belong? How do I fit in? Or who am I? And how do I relate to this big world in which I find myself? Helps us get to the truth question. So We want to ultimately get to the truth question. We can't ignore it because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And to ignore the truth question is not to get to Christ. And so we want to get people ultimately to Him, to point people to His wonderful message of salvation by grace through faith alone, and the good news of the gospel that our sins can be forgiven and we can have a relationship with the Creator God. But we get to the truth question through the belonging question or through the identity question rather than going straight to the truth question, because people are usually not ready to hear it because we do live in this
Mm.
so-called post-truth world. But we cannot punt on that issue and think, well, we're in that kind of world and so we won't talk about those things. You soon aren't talking about the gospel and losing the very essence of the gospel. And whatever gospel you have is a different gospel than what we find in the New Testament itself. But I think we can always recognize we don't have to get there first. Going through the relationship, belonging question, helping people struggle with the identity question, all of those are ways to get to Christ and to the truth question.
Yeah, and it stands out to me that those questions around identity and around belonging and purpose and meaning, those are things that Christianity does have answers for. The Bible does speak to those things, and so often, yeah, maybe we can have too short of a time horizon in our mind as we think about the work of sharing the gospel, of building a relationship, and ultimately bringing someone along to the Lord. Another related question to that: it seems like again in previous generations and maybe even not that long ago, there when it came to apologetics and evangelism, we would often think in terms of rational arguments, of kind of sharing evidence that supported things like the existence of God or the reliability of the Bible or the resurrection of Jesus. And so a big part of apologetics is making arguments and highlighting evidence. And yet today, again, it seems like our culture is, as you said, so focused on things like self determination, on self fulfillment, even on just maximizing pleasure, that people aren't interested in arguments. People aren't interested in evidence. What they really are interested in is the fact that we said, no, you can't have that kind of a relationship. No, you can't do that kind of thing with your body. And that right there is a huge stumbling block for them even considering. So, what advice would you give to Christians when it comes to navigating some of those, just the different emphasis, the different preoccupations that exist today?
I think there's a chapter in our book written by Hal Poe, who is a Crossway author in addition to his chapter in this volume. And he wrote this 3-volume biography on C.S. Lewis. But so he writes chapter in our Confident Witness book on C.S. Lewis' approach to apologetics. And what he describes for us is not an approach or the approach, but multiple approaches that Lewis took in various settings, sometimes as the medieval professor at the university, and sometimes as the author of the kids' stories, and sometimes as the voice of Christianity on the BBC in the middle of wartime. And so he looks at all of these various ways and avenues through which Lewis was able to tell the gospel story, always getting to the point of recognizing Jesus Christ as Lord, but getting there through different streets, different avenues, coming at it from different directions. And so I think our apologetics has to be more versatile, more flexible, make sure we are answering questions that people are asking, not trying to answer questions from previous centuries or maybe even previous decades. And the purpose of apologetics is to make a defense for Christianity, an explanation for Christianity, 1 Peter 3:15, doing so with grace and respect for those with whom we encounter. But we don't want to be a question that is not the question of this day. We want to be trying to answer
Mm.
this question in this context. So I think it requires a new sense of learning to listen well, to, as I said, exegete the culture as well as to exegete the scriptures. A book that was written a few years back on evangelism said, how will they learn to hear the gospel unless we learn to listen? And so I think we have to listen first, understand, and then go in the direction, realize what hat we need to wear. It doesn't mean that we're duplicitous in any way. We're not sharing something different. We're sharing it in a different way for a different audience, a different context,
Mm.
and trying to answer the question that is being asked. So you have to listen for the question. I think it's our responsibility to recognize that sometimes we're called to be a thermostat and sometimes we're called to be a thermometer. So there are times in which we need to be very clear, say, this is what Scripture says, this is the Christian truth. There are other times in which we need to measure where we are. So the thermostat is set on 72, but the thermometer outside is measuring 47. And so we've got a 25-degree difference to make up to get from here to there. And so the dynamic in the conversation, the dynamic of the apologetic task is to be both a thermometer and a thermostat at the same
Mm.
time. We never want to give away the truthfulness of the gospel. We never want to set that aside. But I think getting there requires a deeper sensitivity, a deeper understanding, a greater willingness to listen and learn than ever before. So I think Christians in the 21st century need a new sense of humility. We're not stepping back in any way. I hope we have greater courage and greater conviction than ever before. But we need to come with a sense of humility in that we are participants with those in whom we are trying to share the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a good word and such a helpful metaphor, that of a thermostat versus a thermometer. That yeah, our task in apologetics is both. It's both of those things, to proclaim boldly what the temperature should be, the truth, but also to be sensitive and just aware of what's actually being thought about, what people are believing and understanding, and make sure we understand it correctly. I think sometimes it seems like we can kind of jump to conclusions, perhaps, and even have previous generations worldviews in our mind and not maybe do the homework we need to do to understand the person sitting right in front of us.
Yeah, I think we're called to be the light of the world, to reflect Jesus, who is the light of the world, and we're to be salt and light of the gospel. Sometimes that light, if you walk into a very dark room and people are in a dark room, if you walk in with a candle or a small light, their eyes are attracted. It's almost like a magnet. They come right to that light. But if you come in with a bright searchlight shining on them, they're wince. They turn their head, they close their eyes. They're not ready to receive that. And so I think we have to understand that the world is a dark place right now. Paul said it was in his day. Philippians 2:14 through 16, he encourages the Philippians to be light in the midst of a dark and perverted generation, he says there. But, so we walk into that darkness, but we want to radiate the light of Christ in a way that draws them to the light, not repels them from it.
Maybe as a final question, as you think about the young people, the young men and women that you're interacting with every single day, many of who will go on to be pastors and church leaders throughout our country and even around the world, are you optimistic or more pessimistic about the church's witness and the task of evangelism in the coming decades?
Contrary to some, I'm very hopeful, and I hope it's not naive. I don't think it is. It's not Pollyannish. I think it's a recognition that the Christians coming along, that 18 to 29-year-old group they're still in a very formative stage, but they're going to be the leaders of the middle of this 21st century, recognize the world in which they live perhaps better than we do. And they come with a greater sense of understanding that you cannot assume or presume upon the Christian faith, and that it requires a renewed sense of conviction and courage to live out their faith well and faithfully and effectively. But they also come with an idea that Christian faith requires both verbal witness and a lifestyle, a winsome lifestyle. And so they want to combine those things. I think that my generation, and recognize I'm getting old, but I think my generation tended to think we could do just the verbal witness, and then there's kind of a reaction to that. They see our good works, they'll be attracted to us, and they'll figure out the gospel somehow. It
Yeah,
requires
like preach
both.
the gospel and if necessary, use
Use
words,
words,
that
yeah,
whole
that
sentiment.
famous false statement from St. Francis, right? But I think this generation understands the necessity to walk and talk together, and
Mm.
I'm very hopeful. I love being around students, and I've been privileged to be a part of Christian higher education now for more than 4 decades, and I love the students, but I think this generation of students has a cultural awareness and a conviction about the gospel that's a cause for us not to lose heart at all, but to be hopeful for the next generation.
Well, that's a good word, and we do pray towards that end. Dr. Dockery, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and sharing about this hopeful vision for the future that you have.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a privilege to be a part of the Crossway family.
That was David Dockery on the task of evangelism and apologetics today. For more, be sure to check out the new book he edited for Crossway, Confident Witness, Evangelism and Apologetics for the 21st Century. Pick up a print copy of the book for 30% off, or get the ebook for 50% off directly from Crossway by visiting crossway.org/plus. If you like this interview, check out another conversation I had with William Lane Craig entitled How to Respond to Common Arguments Against Christianity. To listen, click the link in the show notes or search for the episode wherever you prefer to tune in. For more audio content like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend and leaving us a review. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.